As we learned in Unit 1, arguments themselves are not always persuasive. Yeah, that's where rhetoric comes in, right? We use rhetoric and rhetorical techniques to make our arguments persuasive. There are, however, some argument techniques that you need to know for this course. Argument techniques being a sort of rhetorical technique that is specifically designed to enhance arguments. And there are 5 big argument techniques listed in the AP Lang course documents that you need to know for the exam. They are concession, qualification, referenced sources, rebuttal, and refutation. But before we get too much further into this lesson, go ahead and pause this video and complete the reflection that you're given there. Remember, on a reflection response, just write informally and off the top of your head. Let's start by looking at concession and qualification. Both of these techniques are used to acknowledge the limitations of an argument. Concession is when you admit that an opposing argument has merit by either accepting all or a portion of a competing claim as being correct, or by simply agreeing that the competing claim is correct, but under a certain set of circumstances. Qualification, we've already discussed. Qualification is when you admit to the limitations of a particular argument by either specifying specific conditions under which a claim is correct or acknowledging the conditions under which a claim is not correct. Rhetorically, concession and qualification are both used for the same sort of effects. They can enhance logos techniques by making an argument more precise and easier to defend. They can also be used to enhance ethos techniques by making the writer appear more fair-minded. Okay, go ahead and pause the video at this time, and we're going to move on to the first exercise, which asks you to read Heidi Schlump's essay, Slacktivism Makes the World a Better Place from the Couch. Then I've got a series of questions I want you to respond to using complete sentences. Okay, let's take a look at these questions, starting with number 1. What is the writer's primary purpose? In other words, what is the writer trying to make her audience think, feel, or do? Well, Heidi Schlump's purpose here is to, this is an essay, so usually essays are going to be designed to convince, to make readers think, feel, or behave in some way. And here she's trying to make them think in some way, trying to help them think that slacktivism actually can make a difference in the world. That it's while it doesn't maybe directly make those changes by its merits of raising awareness, it makes at least some indirect difference in the world, that sort of thing. Moving on to number 2, what does the writer concede in paragraphs 14 through 17? Well, she concedes 3 separate ideas here. Starting in paragraph 14, she concedes that slacktivism can lead to social loafing, in which people put in less actual effort because they think so many other people are putting in effort so they don't have to, or in which people think that they've done their part by doing something virtually meaningless, like just sharing a meme. In paragraph 15, she concedes that slacktivism often doesn't address systemic change, but rather just helps individuals. In paragraphs 16 and 17, she concedes that slacktivism often isn't real activism, but corporate activism, and does very little. She gives the examples of these short-term boycotts, like turning off your lights for an hour or purchasing pink appliances, which, while symbolic, as she says in paragraph 17, those actions are all about you, not about and your image of feeling like you've done something and looking to others like you've done something. So those are the 3 kind of ideas she concedes in 14 through 17. So question number 3, how does the writer deal with these concessions in paragraph 18? Well, looking back at the concessions themselves, they all kind of boil down to slacktivism being kind of selfish and being kind of focused on the individual and the image of doing something without actually doing something. So in paragraph 18, she addresses this by saying, hey, this isn't just slacktivism, this is just activism in general. She says plenty of old-fashioned activists also are motivated by not so purely selfish motives. And there have always been varying degrees of involvement in causes. So she says that, hey, these are all valid criticisms of slacktivism, but if you're going to say that they're valid criticisms of slacktivism, you can't say that it's unique to slacktivism, because those are all features of activism in general. So that's a very careful distinction she needs to make, but it's critical to pointing out, or to achieving her purpose rather, that slacktivism is another effective form of activism, because although it does have flaws, it shares in the same flaws as non internet activism, that sort of thing. Question number 4, what does the writer concede in paragraph 19? Well, right after she addresses the concessions in 14 through 17 in paragraph 18 there, she immediately makes another concession in 19. And this is where she starts to kind of make her conclusion. This is kind of the beginning of the conclusion of the essay. She says, it's true that amassing signatures does not necessarily result in real change, but it may depend on the cause. And then she gives that example of how she had signed a petition to get a person on death row released who ended up being executed by the state nonetheless. So she's kind of conceding there that slacktivism, and really specifically just signing your name to a petition, doesn't always result in real change. Question number 5, what qualifier does the writer use with this concession? So not only does she make another concession in 19, but she actually qualifies it. And that's where she has that but statement there. It's true that amassing signatures does not necessarily result in real change, but it may depend on the cause. So she's qualifying her concession here to help her ultimately get to the point she makes in paragraph 20 when she addresses that concession. Question number 6, how does the writer deal with this concession and qualifier in paragraphs 20 through 21? Well, she addresses kind of the example that she gives about, signing a petition that ultimately didn't, accomplish its goal, right? But in 20 and 21, she says, even though this form of activism doesn't always accomplish a goal, it can still bring together like-minded people. It can still raise awareness. And while awareness alone doesn't solve problems, she says it's usually a good start. So she acknowledges the shortcomings, and then kind of refutes that or breaks that down by saying that even if it doesn't always work, it can still have, even if it doesn't always achieve its intended goal, it can have other secondary goals of raising awareness and getting more people to support it. All right, finally, number 7, what rhetorical effects does a concession have, either on its own or in the way it enhances a larger rhetorical technique? Well, it does enhance the argument that she's making about slacktivism, how it can make a difference. But I think one of the bigger, more important rhetorical techniques that it's enhancing here is her ethos building technique. She comes across as a fair-minded and knowledgeable individual, and she does so in large part because of all the concessions she makes. How she acknowledges that slacktivism is not as immediately responsible for changing the world, but she still notes that, well, of course, no amount of activism really is. And so this there's tons of concessions that she makes in this text. And I think all of that helps create this fair-minded persona that helps her be more credible to her readership. Okay, getting back to our notes here, referencing ideas from outside sources. When you reference outside ideas, it's used to add legitimacy and credibility to your argument. Sourced ideas can do a lot of things. For one, they can lend weight to the writer's own ideas by providing support, by demonstrating concurrence, by offering examples and illustrations of something, or by explaining or elaborating on key concepts. Sourced ideas can also place a writer's argument within a broader discussion by providing background information on an issue, by framing the different sides of the issue, also by introducing opposing arguments for the purposes of rebuttal or refutation, which we'll talk about in a moment. Rhetorically, sourced ideas can enhance logos techniques by developing an argument in one of those ways I just described. They can enhance ethos techniques by making the writer appear more knowledgeable because they've sought out other sources and are just more well read on the issue. They can also enhance pathos techniques. You can source ideas in the form of narratives and anecdotes that can be particularly emotionally stirring. So, sourced ideas is kind of a big, broad device here that can be used for a lot of different things. All right, let's go ahead and pause the video to complete the second exercise. Look back at Heidi Schlump's essay, then respond to the questions you're given, once again using complete sentences. Okay, let's look at those questions. Number one, what sourced ideas are referenced in paragraph 9 and who authored the ideas? Very important to always be able to tell that information when you see sourced ideas. So in paragraph 9, we've got some ideas from Malcolm Gladwell, both direct quotation and some paraphrase here as well, where he says, Support Our Sisters has garnered more than 33,000 likes, but this is where Malcolm Gladwell actually comes in. High participation does not equal high commitment, argued Malcolm Gladwell in his 2010 New Yorker piece subtitled "Why the Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted." Unlike those who literally put their lives on the line in the 1960s, he said, today's online activists are not motivated enough for high-risk activism. So that's the sourced ideas we have, and they're from Malcolm Gladwell in that 2010 New Yorker piece. Question number 2, what are the sourced ideas used to do? Well, if we look at paragraph 9, really we can't understand what paragraph 9 is trying to do without looking at the paragraph before it, because paragraph 9 is kind of a direct response to what's in paragraph 8, which is talking about the kind of everything paragraph 8 and the preceding paragraphs before it are all about trying to establish how big this trend is of slacktivism, how popular it's getting. Then paragraph 9 kind of calls all of that into question. Is it really becoming popular? Because, as Malcolm Gladwell says, high participation does not equal high commitment. So while it seems to be bringing in a lot of new supporters, this phenomenon of slacktivism, is it actually bringing in people who are committed to creating that change? So here we have a sourced idea that's kind of calling into question some of the recent trends in slacktivism. And finally, question 3, what rhetorical effects do the sourced ideas have, either on their own or in a way they enhance the larger rhetorical techniques? Well, to answer this question, we need only look at the next couple of paragraphs. So right after paragraph 9 with what Malcolm Gladwell says and how he calls into question the efficacy of slacktivism, paragraph 10 is that one little rhetorical question there, or are they? And so we see that the sourced information from Malcolm Gladwell is used to kind of raise this sort of counter argument that the author can then sort of start to rebut or refute. And we'll get into those devices here in just a moment. So that's how it's helping. It's enhancing the writer's argument here by giving the writer something to argue against, this sort of common criticism of slacktivism that the writer can then counter. Continuing with our notes, let's look at rebuttal and refutation. These are two devices that are used to address counter-arguments. A counter-argument is just any argument that opposes another argument. So if you bring up a counter-argument in your essay, it would be an argument that opposes the argument you're arguing. Your argument, consequently, would be a counter-argument to that argument. So it's just any argument that opposes another argument. Generally, by addressing counter-arguments, you're strengthening your own argument. Because if you can not only prove why you are right, but why the opposite position is wrong, that makes for a more convincing argument. So we have two devices here, rebuttal versus refutation. And honestly, a lot of people just use these two terms interchangeably. Technically, though, they do have two different functions or two different devices. Rebuttal is raising doubts about or pointing out flaws in an opposing argument, while refutation is actually proving an opposing argument wrong. Rebuttal, in other words, is used to poke holes in a counterargument by pointing out logically fallacious reasoning, by undermining the credibility of its evidence, by raising counterexamples that go against a generalization that argument makes, or by suggesting different conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence that's given. Refutation, on the other hand, is where you actually argue that the counterargument is invalid. So these two devices often go hand in hand. Rebuttal will raise questions about the counterargument. Refutation will actually prove it invalid or wrong. Honestly, though, being able to distinguish rebuttal from refutation isn't really that important unless you do competitive debate or go on to study law. In AP Lang, try to use the right term, be as precise as possible, but the more important thing is to understand how both of them work. Rhetorically, both rebuttal and refutation can enhance logos techniques by strengthening an argument, and ethos techniques by making the writer appear more fair-minded and knowledgeable about their subject. Let's pause for our final exercise. Look back at Heidi Schlump's essay and respond to the questions you're given, once again using complete sentences. Question number 1, what ideas are rebutted or refuted in paragraphs 11 through 12, and what alternate conclusion is drawn? Well, if you look at paragraph 11 and 12, those are refuting what Malcolm Gladwell argued in paragraph 9. Yeah, by saying that according to a 2010 study by researchers at Georgetown University Center for blah, 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 people who frequently engage in slacktivism or related types of activism were as likely as non-media social performers to donate and twice as likely to volunteer their time. So in other words, people who engaged in these sort of slacktivist behaviors were actually just as likely to do the other sort of activist behaviors, like actually donating money, donating their time to volunteer efforts and that sort of thing, as people who didn't engage in slacktivism. So ultimately, they draw a sort of different conclusion. They use the same sort of evidence that Malcolm Gladwell uses, but they say that while Gladwell and people like him presume that these individuals were replacing more meaningful actions with the slacktivism, in fact, they were only supplementing them. So it's a different conclusion that they've come to, citing the same sort of phenomenon that people like Malcolm Gladwell and other critics of slacktivism have cited. And question number 2, what rhetorical effects does this rebuttal or refutation have in paragraphs 11 and 12? Well, here I think the best thing, the thing I'd write about was how it's strengthening Heidi Schlump's argument here by raising this common criticism that seems like a common sense criticism, that slacktivism is just sort of replacing real activism, right? Because it's easier, right? Why wouldn't people take the easy way out? So by raising that and then rebutting it by noting, hey, there have been studies done that show that it does the exact opposite, I think that she's addressing a common concern that her audience might have, or an objection her audience might have to her argument, thus strengthening her argument. It makes her argument more airtight because she's considered these sort of potential holes that could be in it by doing her research and saying, hey, what critics like Malcolm Gladwell say may not exactly be the case, because other studies have shown that the actual opposite is true. Here now are some bonus argument techniques or devices that you can use in your rhetorical analysis. We'll start with rhetorical question, which is posing a question to the audience where the answer is so strongly implied that it doesn't need actually answering. Okay. Hypophora is another common device. That's posing a question to the audience and then immediately answering that question. I think earlier in the video I pointed out paragraph 10 is just one really short rhetorical question. Actually, that's probably more like hypophora than rhetorical question, because Heidi Schlump asks that question and then immediately answers it in the next 2 paragraphs. Third device, procatalepsis, which is predicting potential counter arguments and then rebutting or refuting them. Procatalepsis is also sometimes called prebuttal because it's not like you're rebutting something that someone has argued, you're predicting that someone might argue against you, and so you kind of cut them off with that, with prebuttal. I like to call procatalepsis the some might say device. So you're not actually rebutting any specific criticism that anyone's had, you're anticipating that some might have this criticism or this counter argument, and then you're using that to refute it. When you write about argument techniques in your rhetorical analysis, it's important to keep a few things in mind. Unlike style devices, argument techniques are actually inherently persuasive, but they can also just be used to enhance other persuasive elements like style elements. So when you write about an argument technique, you can focus an entire rhetorical analysis paragraph on a single argument technique, or you can discuss argument techniques like you would style devices as enhancing other rhetorical techniques. For instance, you could analyze a writer's use of refutation and rebuttal throughout a text as a device, as a means of strengthening several different arguments that that writer makes. Here, you'd want to mention the techniques of refutation or rebuttal in your topic statement of the paragraph. Or, on the other hand, you could analyze a writer's attempt to create a fair-minded persona, and within that analysis, mention their use of something like concession and refutation that enhances that larger rhetorical technique of creating the persona. Here, the argument technique would not be identified in your topic statement, and you just mention it like you would a style device. Okay, we've come to the end of our exercises and notes, but this lesson does have several practice activities. Go ahead and complete the activities as instructed, and I want you to get as far as you can during our scheduled class time today and save the remaining practice activities for next class.